Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Mattia Serra and I'm a researcher at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies here in Milan. Today I'm going to moderate this panel on Syria, which has been organized in cooperation with the Jordanian Center for Strategic Studies. This event is part of the year-long initiative which will lead us to the 9th edition of the RoadMap Dialogues, which is the annual conference on the Mediterranean region co-promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. This year, this conference will be held in Rome from the 2nd to the 4th of November. So, 12 years have passed since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, a conflict that has caused immense devastation and unspeakable suffering to its population. Last May, more than a decade after Syria was suspended from the Arab League, Arab states have decided to reverse their decision and reintegrate Damascus in the League. This highly symbolic decision is the latest step in a process that has led Arab states to re-engage with Damascus. And this process, which has been unfolding for years, has significantly accelerated after the devastating earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey on February 6. But as Arab countries decide to re-engage with Damascus, the civil war in Syria is still at a standstill, and the country's humanitarian crisis does not show any sign of abating. And while humanitarian needs are on the rise, international agencies are forced to cope with funding shortages. So in this context, what has led Arab countries to re-engage with Damascus? What implication is this process likely to have on the domestic level in Syria and also in the regional context? And how have international actors such as the European Union and the United States responded to Syria's readmission to the Arab League? So we're going to ask these questions to our distinguished guests that I'm really happy to introduce here today. Let me start by introducing to you Professor ZAID EYADAT, who is the director of the Jordanian Center for Strategic Studies. Thank you, Professor EYADAT, for being with us today, and thank you for cooperating with us to organize this event.
Thanks to you.
Then our second guest is Dr. MANSOUR ALMARZOQI, who is the director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the Prince Saud Al Faisal Institute for Diplomatic Studies. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation.
And our final guest is Dr. TURKMANI, who is the director of the Syria Conflict Research Program at the London School of Economics. Thank you, Dr. TURKMANI, for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, just a couple of housekeeping rules. I'm going to ask some questions to our guests, and I've asked them to keep their replies relatively short, so 4 to 5 minutes. This is because there is a box in this Zoom, and you know the audience and the public is welcome to ask some questions. I'm going to select them and convey them to the speakers. Having said that, let me start with the first question for Professor EYADAT. Could you please tell us a little bit more about this re-engagement process? What has led Arab countries to decide to re-engage with Damascus, and what role has Jordan played in this process?
Well, thank you very much, Mattia, again, and let me reiterate my gratitude and thanks for you and ISPI for cooperating with the CSS, Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan in Jordan, to organize this panel. And I'm delighted to be with very distinguished guests and speakers today. It's a very big question, and the motives of the various players in the region, in the Arab countries, to re-engage Syria and to welcome Syria back to the Arab League varies from country to country. And always the question would be, why now, and what motivates whom to do what? And just by way of starting the discussion, I always would like to think of the Syrian issue, if you wish, Syrian question, let's call it, by zooming in and zooming out and seeing what is happening within Syria. And the conclusion may be, and we can elaborate on this later, I can see a Mexican standoff where the parties, the conflict, are unable to decisively change the balance of power, breaking with equilibrium, and imposing their first preference or preferences outcomes. And by that, I'm referring to the regime. I'm referring to Northeast player, the Jabhat al-Nusra, and then to Northwest and Northeast, the Kurds. So this is one way to look at it. And it's important to see, given that dynamics within Syria, why the regime is motivated and willing to do what he has done now. Of course, the regime been trying to do so for too long, but there were some regional vetoes on Syria coming back to the Arab League, and we'll get into that in a second. And the second lens to use in order to understanding what's happening is putting Syria in its regional context. And that regional context is not limited to the Arab League nor to the Arab countries. And that will give you a perfect way to understand the motives of various players in bringing Syria back. And the third, of course, is as I said, it's not limited to the Arab League nor to their countries. Then we have to think of other regional players, in particular Turkey, Iran, and Israel, and what are their preferences when it comes to the outcome and the development of the Syrian issue conflict. Or their points of view, and whether to what extent they can impact the outcomes of this conflict. And the third would be the international lenses, and that is, to my mind, it is decisive. And understanding Syria coming back to the Arab League without understanding the international positions on that would be absolutely insufficient to understand the implications and the possible trajectories of such a move. That being said, I will say there are different grouping of Arab countries when it comes to the motives. So you have Syria, you have Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, who've been, working. I mean, Emiratis and Jordan have been working on bringing Syria back since 2018 and 19. And it was the Emiratis who started the process by reestablishing the diplomatic relations with the Assad's regime by reopening their embassy in there. And Jordan has put forward different initiatives, starting with the step-by-step and also by the no-paper positions on Syria, which, in a very simple way, saying that we have to rethink the structures of the incentives given to the regime to have a more cooperative kind of actions on behalf of the regime. And then Saudi Arabia, who've been not necessarily supporting the idea of bringing Syria back to the Arab League, but when they decide that it's time, then it did happen. And that tells us a very important thing about the very central, leading, important role Saudis is playing in the Arab politics. And then you have different group. You have, for example, Oman and Iraq. They never cut their ties with Syria and the Syrian regimes. And you have Qatar, who has different point of view for reasons we can discuss later. And then you have Egypt, which is, I'm just referring to the main players in the game. And then, Sisi and Egypt has different views and ambivalence stands towards the return of Syria to the Arab League. Now, comes to Jordan. There are three important issues, of course. And the main issue is security and security and security. As we all know, Jordan is a host for more than 1.3 million Syrian refugees. More than half of them, almost 700 of them, are registered as refugees with the UNHCR. And you can imagine how that has impacted Jordan's economy and societal interactions. And the second issue, of course, related to the security issues is violence, militias operating in Syria and threatening Jordan. And I'm not only referring to Daesh and Daesh offshore, but I'm referring to the various other militias activities on the border. And of course, the main dominant issue today is drugs and Captagon. And for that, Jordan, in fact, has declared a war in our northern border with Syria, where the military is engaging in the issue. And we've changed the rules of engagement. in order to combat and control and contain this war against, drug war in the borders, dumping the region, the Antar region, with Captagon coming out of Syria. It's estimated that Jordan have received more than 100,000 tablets of Captagon. And it's, the routes of these Captagons coming from out of Syria, manufactured in Syria, controlled by certain power in Syria, and then smugglers taking them to the borders from Jordan and Lebanon all the way to the Gulf and other places, including Europe. Saudi Arabia 2019 actually have registered more than 146 million tablets of Captagon coming out of Syria. So these security concerns in terms of violence and radical associated violence, we've just seen some actions in southern part of Jordan, Amman, and people associated with radical Islamists coming out of Syria, causing troubles in Jordan. There are a lot of sleeping cells related and associated with what's happening in Syria, and this drug dumping coming out of Syria is causing a serious threat to Jordanian security and stability.
Thank you, Professor EYADAT, for this really complete answer to my question. So you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and you also said something at the beginning that I would make mine. You said, why now? So I'm gonna turn to Dr. ALMARZOQI with this very precise and really straightforward question. Why has Saudi Arabia decided to re-engage with Damascus right now? Why has Riyadh decided to push for Syria's readmission into the Arab League?
Well, first of all, thank you very much again for your kind invitation. I'm very happy to be today with you here with this distinguished list of panelists. As to the question of why now and what does Saudi Arabia want out of it, there is a list of important issues that I think would be important to be taken into consideration. First, I have seen academic as well as mediatic debates conflating the rapprochement between Riyadh and Damascus with the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And as Professor EYADAT mentioned, the efforts to readmit, the efforts to explore possibilities with the Syrian regime go back to the year 2018, when Bahrain and the Emirates have changed a little bit their policies towards the Syrian regime. And I would like to call to your attention the statements coming out of our Saudi Arabian Minister of Foreign Affairs. The latest prior to the Iran deal was in Munich Security Forum on the 18th of February, and as early of 2023. And the earliest statements coming out of Saudi Arabia go back to May 2022 about a number of issues. Number one, that the status quo in Syria is not tenable. Number two, there isn't a viable option of finding an immediate solution to the Syrian crisis. And as a consequence, number three, a change of policy towards the Syrian regime, the Syrian crisis is needed. This is almost a year and a half ago, preceding the rapprochement and the invitation extended by Saudi Arabia to Bashar al-Assad to come to the Arab Summit in Jeddah a few months back. That is an extremely important element of context. The other element of context is that the relationship has always been, still is the case, between Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Gulf states, the Arab world at large, on the one hand, and the Syrian regime on the other hand. It has been a relationship of mistrust. There is a dominant perception of the Syrian regime as being there is a lack of reliability, there is a lack of transparency, and there is a huge question about whether we can trust the regime and its promises or not. And this is, theoretically speaking, the justification for the step-by-step approach. Let's see what the regime can do if it commits to certain things, if it delivers on certain promises. These elements are extremely important in my view as constituting the context of the rapprochement. Now, to the immediate justifications, in my view, I do not represent any official point of view, but as a researcher, I think there are two considerations for Saudi Arabia motivating the shift. Let's remember that two countries have tried to bring Syria to the Arab League, and they did not deliver on that goal, the Emirates and Algeria. Saudi Arabia succeeded in doing this. And as Professor EYADAT mentioned, it speaks about the balance of power within the League, within the Arab world, within the Arabian Gulf region to the favor of Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, in my view, wants to achieve two things. Number one, to deal with the question of smuggling drugs. Smuggling drugs has become an institutional policy of Syria pertaining to a number of objectives to generate revenues. And Syrian officials state this openly, that they do not have reliable sources of income, and drugs provide a temporary solution according to them. The regime's officials supervise the manufacturing as well as the assembly lines, as well as the trafficking lines on the borders of Jordan. And this is a huge problem for all of the region, not just for Saudi Arabia. You cannot, from a practical point of view, a realpolitik, you cannot deal with it without talking to the regime. So you have here a major motivation for the rapprochement with the Syrian regime. The second one is the question of refugees. Let's preface this question by saying that any impact on Jordanian security, national security, or economic stability has a direct consequence on Saudi Arabian economy, Saudi Arabian national security. So it is vital for Saudi Arabia that Jordan remains a staple and its economy thriving, hopefully, and its developmental projects on track. So refugees place a huge burden on Jordan, on the social coherence in Jordan. We have seen skirmishes on the borders. We have seen new security concerns emerging from the situation of Syrian refugees. Saudi Arabia hosts, as we speak, almost 800,000 Syrian residents. We have a high sensitivity towards the word refugee. We do not call them refugee, they are residents, and they have full access to the job market, education, healthcare, etc., etc. It's not the case with Jordan, given the economic size of Saudi Arabia. We have the capacity to absorb the impact and consequences of this. It's not the case in Jordan, and therefore it's a priority for Saudi Arabia to contribute to the economic stability of Jordan. The return of refugees requires their safety once they are in Syria. We know that there has been a systematic effort of depossessing the houses, the farms of Syrian refugees and allocating them to members of Iranian militias, etc., etc. The demographic transformation projects of Iran within Syria and all of that dimension. You cannot ensure the security and the safe return of those refugees, be it in Jordan or elsewhere, without talking to the regime. And here you have the second justification for the shift. I cannot emphasize this enough. It's not a normalization. It's not a full return of the Syrian regime to regional politics, to regional questions. Historically speaking, from the 30s Up until the second Gulf War, 4 capitals have cooperated within the Arab world security architecture: Riyadh, Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. It's not a return of that role to Syria, far from it. It is, in my evaluation, a mere exploratory process in which the members of the committee, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, etc., explore how committed the Syrian regime is and potential expansion of cooperation.
Clear, thank you. An exploratory process which started in 2018 with some clear reasons behind them, among them the question of the drug smuggling, so the Captagon issue, and second one, the refugee issue. Thank you. So let me move to Professor TURKMANI. Do you agree with the things that the 2 other speakers said? And what do you think what do you think the implications of this normalization process are going to be for Syria?
Sure. Thank you very much, Mattia, for inviting me. I do agree. I mean, we're not talking about full normalization at all. It is exploratory process here, and it's too early to tell whether it's going to have impact on that the people themselves can feel. It's going to take time, and it just one thing I would like to talk about before going on the impact, because you asked me to talk about the impact that people can feel, not just the impact on the top powers in Syria. If the regime knows that this rapprochement is motivated in part by the issue of Captagon and the threat of all these illicit drugs and other illicit material going through the borders, then we are also creating a vested interest for the regime to keep that threat going. You might see a reduction in the activities in the beginning just to show that it can deliver, but it's not going to eliminate that threat, because that what gives it now the new reason to exist in the Arab world. So I think we have to be very, very careful here and not expect a full commitment from the regime on this issue. But again, as I said, it's still early days to talk about whether this is going to have an impact that the people can feel, because of course the normalization, caused lots of division. There are conflicting views in it. My interest is just, are the people, the ordinary people, going to see a positive impact, a concrete one that they can feel? Because until now, the only concrete thing they can feel out of everything that happened, even political initiatives, everything is negative. When are they going to see something positive? It's still not clear. But the rapprochement could potentially have a positive impact on the people that people can feel. But there are a set of conditions that have to be there for the people to feel it, and not to end up as a process that feeds the very corrupt power sitting at the top and playing with many cards, including terrorism and the issue of Captagon. So the positive impact would come, for example, if any new funds arrive to Syria, would be felt by the people, would benefit the people. And for that to happen, they need to stimulate the economy, not to end up just a big funding very big projects or very big companies. Often, most of the big ventures now in Syria, they are all linked to the corrupt power structure. The ones that are independent either left the country, or they kind of keep their size to medium level, because beyond that you have to become partner of the network of cronies. So if any funds manage to reach that level, reach the SME level, the small, medium, and even micro enterprises, and help them to recover the economy from the bottom up, then yes, people certainly will feel the benefits. Even if there are, some people are talking about potential investment in infrastructure. And again, if this investment in infrastructure, for example, let's say electricity power plant, if it's targeted towards, let's say, industrial zones, for example, that would certainly help the people, because it will help the companies, the workshops and factories, and that would certainly have an impact that people can feel. If travel becomes easier in and out of Syria, people will also have a positive impact to feel, because that has been a huge issue. Like even people in Saudi Arabia or in Jordan, if they want to go to Syria, it's very complicated and it costs a lot of money. They have to go to Lebanon, and from there to cross the borders, it's always risky. I mean, so if travel, the expats' ability to go in and out of the country becomes easier, even if we get some tourists, all of that would certainly lead to a concrete positive impact that people can feel. Also, and I think this is extremely, extremely important, what strings would come with any money that is going to flow into Syria from the Arab world, if it ever comes, So let's say there is a funding for infrastructure project or whatever it is. What are the strings? We need all the strings that forces everyone to adhere with good governance, transparency, and accountability. Otherwise, again, we are just cementing the very corrupt system that is now living out of drug, and it's going to continue to live out of drug, even if it promises otherwise. So it's really, I can't stress this strong enough, is that the requests for accountability and transparency are very, very important. Sadly, the sanctions and everything else and the nature of the regime created a reality in Syria where people accept that things can happen outside the formal routes, outside bank transfer, which really enables corruption and ends up with money going to the wrong hands. So restoring the financial routes and making sure that everything is monitored, that is really important, not just to help the people now, but also to boost the buildup of a better governance in Syria on the long term. Another issue is if there is also really a curb on the Captagon smuggling across the borders, that would certainly help the Syrian people. We've been conducting research recently on SMEs in Syria, and we interviewed businesses from every part of the country. And one of the things that most of the businesses, especially the manufacturing businesses in government-controlled areas, said is that one of the biggest hits have been on their businesses recently is the Captagon trade, because it ruined their reputation. That was their most important capital in the region. The reputation of the Syrian products, of the Syrian businesses, has been completely ruined. So I spoke, for example, to a businessman in Aleppo. He has a factory and managed to resurrect his factory. He was so happy. Finally, after a long wait, he got an order from Iraq. He prepared the shipment, everything. Next day, Captagon shipment that was caught on the border with Iraq, so his order was cancelled. So we have to understand that Captagon is not only causing a negative impact in the region, but also on the Syrian sources of livelihood as well. So I do hope that people will see these benefits, but we just have to wait and see for now.
Thank you for this really realistic perspective on this re-engagement process. So let's stay a little bit on these issues that you were talking about, the Captagon trade, this drugs trade. Professor EYADAT, could you please elaborate a little bit more about the security situation in southern Syria, its implications on the security of Jordan, and also Jordan's perspective on the Captagon trade?
All right. So there are a few things first before I delve into that, and I'm going to thank both the speakers for their impressive insights. And yes, Mansour, Jordan and Saudi Arabia's security is linked, and Jordan's stability and prosperity is vital to the national interest and security of Saudi Arabia. And I do share you your hopes that the people of Syria would actually benefit of this kind of recent developments, bringing the regime back into the Arab League, hoping to control the drug smuggling issue. But as you said, it's too early to judge and see whether it's going to work or not. And more importantly, actually, bringing the regime back into the Arab League with the controlling of smuggling is giving the regime is a very, very important card to use to his advantage. And this is not something as good for the Syrian conflict itself or for the neighboring countries. And more importantly, yes, we political scientists and analysts tend to not to distinguish between, regime and people. But, if anything is not leading to the benefits of the Syrians and the Syrian people, including the safe return of the refugees, then the whole thing is, going back to square number one, even if not zero. And we have to be also careful when we are saying these things. And honestly, I don't think, first, the whole thing is of any strategic value. So regime coming back to the Arab League, attending meetings, is not a game changer, neither to the conflict in Syria and the crisis in Syria itself, nor to the regional security arrangements. And it was motivated by, trying to explore what might happen and finding different ways of reshaping the regime and reshaping the region and its arrangements. And this is lots to be said here, and I should doubt on it. But go back to the smuggling, the Captagon, how that is impacting Jordan and Jordan's security. When I say that Jordan has declared war in the northern border, that tells you you're not really fighting smugglers. These are sponsored smugglers. They're very supported, very well trained. We're dealing with militias. And here I'm not only talking about, the Iranian influence and activities in southern part of Syria, not only shaping and reshaping and changing the nature of demographic outlook of the area, but also, creating a series of cooperative entities, institutions, businesses, militias, radicals, etc., etc. And of course, Iran is doing that, not necessarily to pressure Jordan, which is part of it, but this is the part of the Iranians' games in balancing out with Israel. And Iran being in the southern border of Syria, northern border of Jordan, close to Israel, this is the game. And that's why we had that agreement under the Russian auspices before the war for Russian invasion of Ukraine, where Iranians troops and militias and supported networks should stay at least 70 kilometers away from Jordanian border to ensure Jordan's security and also not to constitute a threat to Israel. So these Iranian activities, combined with regime interest and benefits out of smuggling drugs to achieve, political and economic ends, are considering an acute, imminent threat to Jordan's security and stability. And I'll tell you, for example, the trade or the smuggling is estimated at around, I think this is the UN report, around $10 billion per year. And the regime is receiving about $1 billion out of that. So you can imagine the other 9 going to whom? So who controls this money and where the money goes and what interest that is creating? And second, the entire $10 billion exceeds far away the legal exports of Syria. So in terms of revenue, this is vital. Despite the fact it's impacting actually the natural, small companies, small businesses, and also reputable manufacturers in Syria. But again, you have winners and losers, and there seem to be the winners out of this smuggling business happen to be powerful players in the Syrian theater. And that's why it is a very, very difficult, very challenging to be dealing with these things. Now, Captain coming into Jordan and staying in Jordan, how that is impacting social stability and social coherence, and impacting the rate and level of crimes, the consumptions, especially among youth, university students and school students, and how that is impacting the entire health system, how it's impacting people's behavior. These are very serious issue. And also, when you use most of your resources, security and military, in order to deal with this particular issue, that's a distraction from main other threats. And we're not in a very pleasant situations in the region and in Jordan. So in that sense, and by the way, recently, I'm not sure if you're following, I'm certain you're following, there have been actually escalating in the drug smuggling using drones. This is new techniques, and smuggling not only now drugs, but also Captagon and others, illicit issues, but also weapons. And again, to whom, for whose interest, and who's sponsoring the whole operations, and how you can break out with that. And that if I want to link that to the expectations of bringing the regime, exploring ways back to the Arab League, exploring ways, finding paths of trying to rehabilitate, finding ways of dealing with these challenges, I think we actually lack lots of pressuring points. So, for example, there is no milestones on what the regime has to do on what, no time limits, timelines. You have to do this and this. This is the step by step, and no metrics of measuring whether we're doing what we agreed to do or not. And worst of all, there is no enforcing mechanisms to make sure if the regime is doing or not. And worse, even politically, there is no punishments sets. If you don't do it, then these are the punishments. Because just imagine, let's say the Arab League decided that, well, the regime is not actually, there's no compliance, and then the whole thing has to be just stopped. The regime thinks, Syrian regime, he has to lose very little, if at all. So we need to rethink that. We need to rethink that at all.
Thank you for that. So I think you did something really useful for this conversation, because you also mentioned the regional context. And now I want to move to Dr. ALMARZOQI for this. So where does Riyadh's current stance on Syria, I mean, what does this stance tell us about Saudi Arabia's priority at the regional level? And where does Syria fit in this regional context for Saudi Arabia?
Gladly. If you allow me, with your permission, I would like to offer a few comments really quickly. Thank you. Of course, as I said before, the drug smuggling business for the Syrian regime, and again, it's supervised by high-ranking military personnel. They are guarded by military equipment and military personnel. So it's not the regime is heavily involved in the process with the help of some Iranian militias, of course. The aim is to generate money, but the other aim, as was mentioned by my two colleagues, is to gain political leverage. And this is not something to be cemented now. It is something in the DNA of the Syrian regime. And I can offer you a few examples. They have used the question of terrorism with Western countries in order to affect their position vis-a-vis the Syrian uprisings. And they succeeded. Bashar al-Assad succeeded with the help and advising of Iran and Hezbollah. It worked when they told the West, either us or terrorism. And now they are employing the same tactics. Bashar al-Assad has used the question of al-Qaeda and terrorism by opening lines, supervising lines to provide fighters and arms into Iraq. And technically speaking, there is still a complaint lodged by Nouri al-Maliki, the closest ally of Iran in Iraq in 2008, against the regime of Bashar al-Assad in the Security Council. complaining about Syrian sponsorship of Al-Qaeda bombings in Iraq in 2008, September 2008. So it's not something new for the Syrian regime to use Al-Qaeda, Daesh, or drugs. So nobody is reinforcing this behavior in the regime. It is in the DNA of the regime. The other element is that it's not something new. Hezbollah uses drugs for both purposes, political leverage as well as generating money. And we are far away from talking about funding anything in Syria. This is my evaluation. All the extent of any financial role in this exploratory process is assistance or incentives. And these are structurally different approaches. It's not funding, it's not reconstructing, it's not funding development or rehabilitating the Syrian economy, etc., etc. It's providing incentives and limited assistance. And there are actually several cards of influence. They are not extremely impactful. Nonetheless, they are still cards of pressure on the Syrian regime. The Emirates opened the door for Bashar al-Assad and rolled out red carpet in 2018, etc., etc. Then they complained that Bashar al-Assad did not wisely use this opportunity. What did they do? They freezed the effort. Then the regime became hungry for legitimacy and recognition, and this is part of the process that we have seen in the past few months. So the regime badly needs legitimacy, not only for the media or political discourse, but also in the regime is caught in the crosshair of conflict between Russia and Iran. Legitimacy and support provides the regime with certain means of attempts, modest, but remain attempts of balancing these two actors inside Syria. So I advise against underestimating the question of legitimacy and recognition. The other thing being incentives and financial assistance. Now back to your question, the priorities for Saudi Arabian foreign policy in the region. Strategically speaking, Saudi Arabia sees the problem one step before the question of security, namely, and the weakness of central governments. The weakness of the nation state creates strategic gaps exploited by expansionist foreign policies, such as Iranian expansionism or Turkish expansionism, as well as non-state actors filling those gaps in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. Wherever you see a weak nation state, weak state institutions, you see strategic gaps in security, development, etc., filled and exploited by state and non-state actors. Hence, the number one priority for Saudi Arabian foreign policy in the region is the strength of the nation state. Number two, and it's interconnected, is the strength of regional institutions. Regional crises have become a political ball for the interests of the US, Europe, and some other countries. Russia, when Russia wanted to break off isolation after invading Crimea in 2014, they used their presence in Syria to achieve those goals. So regional, and when the US wanted to achieve a deal with Iran, they behaved in a certain way when the Syrian regime used chemical weapons. So foreign powers use the crises of the region to their advantage, and it's not something new. So the strength of regional institutions reduces the cost of this phenomenon. Hence, the strength of regional institutions is a priority for Saudi Arabian foreign policy. And it goes without saying, security of borders, maritime security in the Arabian Gulf, the Arab Sea, the Gulf of Oman, the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, etc., etc. And the last point is that there is a strategic concept influencing not just the foreign policy of Saudi Arabia, but also the development policy of Saudi Arabia. And this is very straightforward. We cannot develop alone. We need the region to develop in order for us to be able to develop. In order for Vision 2030 to succeed, we need a thriving Jordanian economy, Egyptian economy, Iranian economy to be stable and thriving, Iraq, and the whole region of the Arabian Gulf. So this is a priority for Saudi Arabian foreign policy.
So development and stability, very clear. So one final question for Dr. TURKMANI. We've been talking about the local context in Syria, about the regional context. Let's talk about the international one. You were in Brussels during the last conference on the future of Syria. How do you assess the response of the European Union and in general, the response of the international community to this re-engagement process with Syria?
Sure. So far, what we've seen from the European Union and also from the US as a reaction to this normalization is just reiteration of their previous positions. Like, we cut all our ties with the regime, we're not going to normalize, blah, blah, blah. So just re-stressing their own position and that they are not ready to jump on the wagon of normalization. But we also have seen many European officials visiting the Arab world, talking to Arab officials and diplomats. So they're certainly trying to understand what's going on and what can they do, how they should position themselves. I was at the last conference, Brussels conference for Syria, and it was noted there was no one was invited from the Syrian government, not even the Red Crescent, which usually is invited. Only somebody a little bit kind of lower ranking from the Red Crescent was present and not on an official basis. So they are distancing themselves from that trend, but I don't think they can afford to do this for very long. And when I talk to them about it, my advice is two things. One is to, instead of normalizing with the regime, normalize with the Syrian people. See what you can do to reach out to the Syrian people themselves, who have been treated now for 10 years as the recipients of humanitarian aid. This is not how Syrians used to survive throughout their history. We want something more proactive, helping them to rebuild their lives, their businesses, livelihood, agriculture, all these things. Normalize with the people, not with the regime. Number two is actually to rejoin the international and regional track. There is a regional track now. It has started. We can't ignore it. But the region on its own, I don't think it's capable of providing a solution. We tried that 10 years ago. It was the period of the Arab solution for Syria. I myself went to Egypt, spoke to the head of the Arab League. We were all full of hope that the region will be able to drive the solution. That was more than 12 years ago, and nothing came out of it. So I think still they need the efforts of the international community, and for these two tracks to rejoin, I think we need to go back to the period of the joint special envoy. If we remember Mr. Brahimi, when he was the special envoy to Syria, he was the joint envoy of the Arab League and the UN. After him, Mr. de Mistura was the UN only. So the Arab League have left that track by then. And I think we need to go back to that. We need to have a new mediator, ideally an Arab mediator of a big weight who can drive the process, but have the others with him, because without the Europeans, without the Americans and the rest of the community, I don't think we're going to see a lasting solution in Syria.
Thank you, Dr. TURKMANI, for this. So unfortunately, time has run out, so I have to close this conversation. I think it was a really interesting panel. We touched upon really interesting issues. I mean, we touched upon really a lot of things in just 45 minutes. So thanks a lot to all the three speakers for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. TURKMANI, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. ALMARZOQI, for joining us. And thank you, Dr. EYADAT, for this conversation. It was a pleasure to co-organize this event with your center. So thanks finally to the audience for listening to this conversation, and see you in Rome. Goodbye, everyone.